Recording now. Dr. Wilmore has posted his biography on the screen. We'll get that advanced. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on his introduction. I would like to highlight, however, that he's been an adjunct professor for CMU's global campus for over 16 years, and he had a successful 24-year career with the Air Force. In addition to being an educator and a consultant, Dr. Wilmore is an author and recently published a downloadable handbook for learning professionals called Keys to How We Learn, 10 Perspectives on Learning. And with that introduction, please join me in welcoming Dr. Todd Wilmore.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. The idol of the day pushes the hero of yesterday out of our recollection and will in turn be supplanted by his successor of tomorrow. That was a quote from Washington Irving. And it's very true today that we may be the hero, we may be the prime, most important person in an organization, but someday we're going to be replaced by our successor. So that's the topic we're going to be talking about today, is succession planning. Originally, we were going to be talking about replacing executives, CEOs, CFOs, but succession planning isn't just about CEOs anymore. It goes much deeper than that, much broader than that. So why should we be concerned about succession planning? Why should we really be worried about who's going to replace who tomorrow? Well, the 10,000 is the number of average baby boomers retiring each day. That's a huge number of people, and with that goes a lot of experience, a lot of knowledge, a lot of expertise, and they're going to have to be replaced. 23.4% is the average turnover rate expected over the next 5 years. Now currently it's 20.6, so you can see how much that's going to increase. So turnover is another area where we're going to be losing critical people, losing knowledge and expertise, and we're going to have to replace that. 192 million is the number of workers predicted to depart companies worldwide in 2018. So if you're a global company, you're going to be dealing with this issue of turnover and loss of employees and succession planning around the world. 38 to 40 million is the potential shortage of college-educated workers in 2020. And a lot of these key positions, critical positions in organizations that need succession planning, are positions that require high levels of education. In advanced economies, demand for high-skilled labor is now growing faster than supply. That's a report from McKinsey in 2012. So the demand for these skills, demand for high-skilled people is growing, and yet we don't have the people to replace them. Or you might have heard comments like this around the workplace. Sorry, boss, there's no one ready to fill the vacancy. Or it costs how much to replace Mary? Or we may be thinking about why we lack so many minorities and women at senior levels. Why did that happen? It could be because of lack of succession planning. So I'm going to have you take a real quick quiz. Yes or no is all you have to answer. You can answer in the chat, or you can just keep a note for yourself. As we answer these 9 questions, do you know which work processes in your organization are most susceptible to changes in personnel? Which of them are most susceptible to losing critical people? Do you know how your future organizational demographics will change from your current ones? What kind of shifts are going to happen in terms of demographics, in terms of gender, in terms of race, in terms of different national origins? Do you know what technology changes might affect the resources that you're going to need in the future? When technologies change, will that change the skills, the competencies of key people in your organization? Do you know the skills and behaviors that will make future leaders successful? Do you know all the people in key positions who are retiring this year? Do you know the potential new leaders who can develop the competencies that are needed for those positions of those people that are retiring? Do you know the average age and tenure of current key people? So you can start projecting what's going to happen in the future. Do you know your current attrition rate in key positions? And do you know what work processes and positions are most critical in your organization? Well, if you answered yes to all 9 of those questions, you've got a good handle on succession planning. Otherwise, you might want to keep listening. So a question I'll always get from people is there an easy way to look at succession planning? And the answer is no. But we can learn critical elements of a process that will make it a little bit easier for you to do succession planning in an organization. These 5 processes we're going to look at are critical positions. Do you know the critical positions? Have you identified key positions when they might become vacant? The positions that are needed to support business continuity. Do you know the competencies that will be needed to be successful in those positions and to meet future business challenges? Do you know the gaps? Have you developed a pool of talent and listed people who might be ready to fill positions, these potential successors, and plan for their future? And you know what they need, what they don't need. Do you develop in the successor talents and competencies, and do you capture this expertise and the knowledge of people who are going to be leaving? And do you have the metrics and measures that you need in place to evaluate your succession plan? So those are the 5 areas we're going to be looking at. Now typically what people think of when they think of succession planning, it doesn't have to be about a complex process practiced by only large and sophisticated organizations. We tend to think, well, this is a large organization, they have a lot of key positions. When you lose one, we know we're going to have to replace that position. But small organizations too, and medium-sized organizations stand to suffer a great loss if a key performer leaves unexpectedly. Because in small and medium organizations, there may be only one person in a really key position, only one deep, and when you lose that person, it makes a big difference. Of course, succession planning is not about pre-promoting, it's not about pre-selecting people. It's about preparing potential successors to take on the responsibilities and looking over a long-term 12 to 36-month view, anticipating which key positions may be vacated in the future. So where do we start? Good question. We start with our critical positions. Do we know what critical positions are? Do we know what they are? Critical positions may be positions that impact business operations like financial operations, process efficiencies, and they may be due to retirement, attrition, voluntary separation, but we need to know what these critical positions are and what would happen if they became vacant. Now, one type of critical position might be called a single incumbent position. A single incumbent position, where we may have multiple positions in the organization, but there's only one position, one key position that has the expertise or knowledge or something special about them, and it's only what we call a one deep position. Now, off the top of your head, can you think of a position, can you name a title or type of position that might be a single incumbent position in organizations? Any ideas? What would be a single incumbent position in your organization? CEO, CFOs, those are the obvious ones. But are there other positions in research and development or engineering or sales? Other key positions that are single incumbent positions that are very essential, and if we lose that person in that position, we may not have somebody who can step in right away. So those are the kind of positions we're looking at in your organization. Data scientist, that's good, Tom. And a data scientist kind of fits our next position as well. Positions that require specialized knowledge and expertise. Something that requires special knowledge, special education, or special expertise. A third position might be a position that's at high risk of losing people, or at high risk, somebody is at high risk of leaving. People in these positions are typically, they don't get the development that they would like, or they don't have the promotion opportunities. Maybe they've reached the pinnacle of that particular area and they can't get promoted. There's no place to go. They're very high performers in a critical function, but they may be dissatisfied because they suffer from burnout in that position. There's a high demand of skill sets that might draw them away from that position. But these are these critical positions that have a high risk of leaving for a number of different reasons. We need to identify what they are as well. Of course, this one speaks for itself. There are people that are in positions where they're ready to retire. Vulnerable individuals that have expressed the intention to retire, or they're at that age where we typically see them retiring. We need to be concerned about those positions as well. So those 4 examples of positions that you might want to identify in an organization. Now, all these positions are driven by the goals of the organization and the strategy of the organization. So where one position in one organization might be critical, the same position in another organization may not be. So you have to identify that for each organization based on its own goals. So any questions about critical positions? So we're going to identify those critical positions in organizations, and it's usually not that difficult because you can look around an organization and you usually know which positions are critical, which positions are single incumbent or where there's a high risk of burnout and you know you're going to have attrition and turnover. And those are positions that we want to look at for possible succession planning. So what's the next step then? Well, we need to look at the competencies of those positions. And what I mean by competencies are not necessarily the technical skills, not necessarily the tasks a person performs, but the competencies that are required to perform the position, like leadership, like curiosity, persistence, problem solving, teamwork, imagination, time management. Some positions require different levels of competencies. Sales positions might require negotiating skills, whereas other positions like that data scientist might require problem solving skills. But we need to identify what these competencies are. So that once we've identified those critical positions, the next step is to try to identify the competencies. And there's a number of ways we can identify it. The first thing is to take a look at the superstars in your organization, the people that really excel at these positions. Hopefully it's your current incumbents. But we want to look at these superstars in these positions, and we want to ask them questions in a number of different ways. There's 2 ways you can ask them questions to try to determine thematically what are the key competencies. One is behavioral interviews, where you're going to ask them what they've done in the past. What did you do when you had a difficult customer? When you were negotiating a contract, how did you deal with a difficult customer who demanded something and they wouldn't change, wouldn't compromise? How would you handle a difficult situation in manufacturing when you had a piece of equipment breakdown or you were lacking the materials? You didn't get the materials shipped in that you needed. So you find out from people what their behaviors were when they succeeded, and that gives you an idea of what competencies your future people are going to need. Same thing with situational interviews. You can talk to people about what would they do in a situation where they had to deal with an employee who came to work drunk, or an employee who came to work and was pilfering money or skimming from the till. How would you handle that situation? So if you talk to somebody who is considered a superstar and excels in their position, and you ask them what would they do in certain situations, that will give you ideas about what kind of competencies that position takes. You might use job analysis, the typical job descriptions, to give you some ideas, and you also might look at performance measures in an organization, such as performance evaluations or performance evaluation systems. So from those types of activities, we can come up with a pretty good determination of what the best people do in the critical positions in an organization. So the first 2 steps aren't that difficult to do, and in a lot of cases you can do this in a fairly short time because you're familiar with the positions and you're familiar with your organization. So the next thing you need to do is identify the gaps, and the gaps I'm talking about are those between the potential future successors, those individuals in the yellow figures here, and the people in the green, the people who are in the current critical positions that are succeeding and successful. So what we want to do is identify the gaps between those 2 groups and take some of these potential successors and start developing them. But we need to know what those gaps are. We need to know why they're not able to do the things they need to do, where are they the weakest, and where do we need to start working on developing them. Because remember, this is not about pre-selecting successors, it's about preparing potential successors for those new positions. And so to do that, we can do some of the similar things we did in identifying the competencies needed in key positions. We could do some behavioral interviews to find out what these potential successors have done in the past when they were in difficult situations. We could use a fishbowl exercise where we have experienced managers watch them interact with each other in a team building or a leadership or problem-solving exercise. Or we could do in-basket exercises. Some of you are all familiar with in-basket exercises, giving somebody tasks and priorities and problems, let them prioritize them and arrange them in a timeline for how they would manage those particular problems in the future. So that's a couple of ways you could do it. These are things you've seen in management schools, leadership schools, so this is nothing new, but it'll help us to identify in those potential successes what the gaps are. We might also look at their experience based on have they had any overseas assignments, have they had assignments in different departments within the organization that has given them some experience that may be unique and required for these critical positions they're going to fill. We might give them assessments, use a 360 assessment where we're not just assessing them based on their personal responses, but we're assessing them based on their managers, fellow managers, their peers, and their subordinates. And we might use something like the DISC inventory to evaluate something about their personality. And of course, we can always look at their performance reviews to see what former managers have said about them in terms of their strengths and weakness. We might look at our databases that we have in the organization. Everybody has databases, a human resource information system database, customer relation management database, Salesforce automation software, learning management system. We'll have a number of different databases that we can look to see what their education is, what their training has been, what their career interests are, what assignments have they had, how much mobility have they shown through an organization in terms of lateral mobility from department to department or vertical mobility up and down the organizational chart. So we can collect all this information on an individual, potential successor, and once we've done that, we can put it into something like this. And this is a typical competency assessment matrix. You've probably seen something like this before when we try to determine where a person is in terms of having the certain skills or certain competencies that they're going to need. Or another one would look something like this. It would be a simple table. These are things that you've seen before, but you can set up something that works for you, and that's what's most important, is you use something that works for you. So we've identified the critical positions. We've identified the competencies that are required for these positions. And now we've looked at some of the potential successes we have, and we've looked at some of the gaps between where they need to be and where they are today. So any questions so far? And we did have a couple of questions earlier asking about organizations that are doing this well and organizations that maybe aren't doing it so well, and how this is working with civil service. And we're going to bring some of that up in just a short while, too. So the fourth step in the process, we need to develop these successors. And this is where it gets a little more difficult. So far, it hasn't been that difficult because it's intuitive to most of us. But now we also have to develop these individuals, and we have to capture the expertise and knowledge of those people in critical positions that are leaving. So how do we do that? What do we need to consider when creating these career development plans for these potential successors? Well, two things right off the bat. An employee or a potential successor needs to own their plan. No matter how much we mandate training or mandate development for certain individuals, they have to own that plan. They have to buy into it. They have to be motivated to follow up on it. If they don't, maybe they're not really somebody we want to categorize as a potential successor for critical position. And if they do buy that plan, they do own their plan, we have to tailor that plan to match the essential competencies that they need. Oftentimes we get into developing potential successors and we just give them a blanket coverall of development activities. And that really is a waste of time and money. We don't need to do that. We need to focus on the essential competencies that they need based on the gaps that they have. Within those plans, we need to develop formal long and short-term goals, target dates and milestones. So this has to be a personal development plan. You're familiar with this in organizations. This is what we do, but we're not just doing this as a general rule. We're not just doing this for the benefit of an individual in their current job. Remember, we're trying to develop them to fill competencies, to prepare them for competencies and roles in future critical positions that may become vacant in the next 12 to 36 months. Some of the ways we can do that is to give them action assignments, things that are going to require them to work on a certain project, take a certain action. We might give people experiential assignments, just simply an assignment to put them, to expose them to certain roles, to expose them to certain types of activities that are going to help them learn the competencies that we talked about earlier. We might give them a stretch assignment that's going to take them out of their typical day-to-day position, their day-to-day customer service center operation, and put them in a position where they're going to have to deal directly with customers rather than managing people who are dealing with customers. There was a study that was done by PayScale called Gen Y on the Job. And as a result, they found that institutional knowledge and history and business continuity, things that the silent generation and the baby boomers had, might vanish in the next few years if we don't do something to help Generation Y and Generation X workers to acquire that knowledge and expertise. And that's why you've heard a lot about knowledge management, and I'm sure in every organization you have some knowledge management activity, or you've at least heard the term knowledge management. How do we manage the knowledge that exists in an organization in such a way that we don't lose it when people leave? We need to identify that critical knowledge in critical positions. So go back to those critical positions as single incumbents, areas with special knowledge, and areas that have a high risk of attrition, and critical positions where people are vulnerable for retirement. We need to identify what is the knowledge that they have in those areas. What do they know that we need to retain? In order to do that, we need to have tools and resources, ways, strategies, tactics to capture and retain and then transfer that institutional knowledge to ensure that that institutional knowledge and information is transferred to those successors. And some of the ways we can do that are listed on the screen, and you've seen some of these before. So you might not have thought about these in terms of succession planning. You might have just thought about them in terms of development within your own organization. But these are specific tools and activities that we can use to prepare people for new positions. One is job rotation, where you can rotate people from job to job, from assignment to assignment. And I'll give you an example of that in just a minute. Talk about job enhancement, where you add extra responsibilities or extra duties to a position that would take them outside of their normal department area, normal area of responsibility into other areas. You can have them shadow the people in critical positions. So I can give you an assignment to have you shadow somebody for a week, follow them around, go to meetings, watch what they do, try to pick up some of that institutional knowledge. That's the kind of information, the kind of knowledge that's very difficult to capture on paper, difficult to teach somebody in a workshop or a training format. It's information that you only get if you watch somebody, you shadow them, that you have an opportunity to experience what they do. Here's an example of job rotation. Talk about Rowena Lee's story. She's fresh out of school with a bachelor's degree and a master's in mechanical engineering. Lives in Hoboken, New Jersey, and she's working for L'Oreal USA. She's in a job ordering supplies from vendors. Then, as part of her job rotation, she's sent over to the engineering department at a L'Oreal plant where she becomes a processing project engineer. And she goes to a plant where they make cosmetics. She's 25 years old, and now she's responsible for making improvements to equipment and determining whether machines need to be updated, whether they can be adequate 3 years from now. So as it turns out, many of the skills that she's picked up in her first rotation are coming in handy in her second rotation. So what she was doing in ordering supplies, she's finding that's useful in ordering materials or ordering equipment for the plant. So she's participating in what they call a 4-year rotation program. L'Oreal does this for young managers. It's been around 20 years they've been doing this. It started out with just 1 or 2 young people, but now they have 77 people, with about 40 more people coming on board, or that came on board just a couple years ago. And the goal of their job rotation is to produce the next generation of company leaders. And they're doing this by rotating these people in these challenging positions and giving them that experience and collecting that informational or that institutional knowledge. It's particularly important. They're doing this for young women particularly in the areas of science, technology, engineering, and math, or those STEM careers. So that's an example of how you can use job rotation. And L'Oreal is one of the companies that probably does a good job of using succession planning as a way of filling these critical positions, making sure that they're going to have people prepared for those positions, but also as a way of creating more positions for underrepresented groups like women and minorities. Now, you can also use job aids as a way of collecting information. That's a simple, basic way we do it, but we don't always remember to do it. If you think about threat levels, if you think about how do you order something, and we have job aids, often called cheat sheets. But if you have a critical position, somebody has critical knowledge, but it's not written down, this is a good way of writing it down so that successors are going to have an opportunity to keep that knowledge in the future. Of course, there's also process documentation. If you haven't done this, if you have certain processes that only critical people know, then we need to make sure we have some kind of a process chart or process map that shows us how that information flows or shows us how that process flows, so we'd be able to capture that knowledge for future people. Of course, there's always best practices, things that have worked in other settings that might be transferable to new settings. Best practices is something we get in meetings, we poll employees, we do studies. But again, it's something we can do to capture that institutional knowledge, make sure it doesn't go away. So you say, well, what's this got to do with succession planning? Well, the problem with succession planning is we're going to lose somebody with critical knowledge, somebody with critical skills, somebody who's in single D position, and it's probably not going to be possible to take one person, put them under the wing for a few months, and expect them to learn that institutional knowledge in a short time. Even if you were able to have somebody shadow a critical position for 6 months, which is unlikely because the position is probably going to be vacant in 2, even if you are able to do that, it's unlikely that a young person, a new person, is going to be able to capture that knowledge without having it written down or collected somewhere. So it might end up also in document repositories, like paper or electronic depositories. So Dan asked a question, how well understood is the process of succession planning among senior leaders in various organizations, and who has the primary responsibility to track, develop, and make recommendations to these? Senior leaders, HR trainers, middle. How well understood is the process? I would say that it's probably not very well understood, even in large organizations. I'll stop right now and just give you an example of that before we move on to the last part about metrics. Back to Dan's question, you think about organizations like Apple. Now we're going to take an example I'm sure all of you can relate to. Think about Apple. A few years ago, Steve Jobs, the founder of Apple, became ill, and he knew that he wasn't going to live too many more years. So he built a library of instructional and multimedia materials to help continue his legacy by helping his successor have access to information that he would need. And then Tim Cook, who was his successor, had been groomed for many years. They'd been preparing him and planning to move him into that position. They didn't pre-select him, they were preparing him. There were other candidates, but it became clearer as time went on that Tim was the one that was learning the best, that was going to be the best replacement, that would best follow the practices of Steve Jobs. So that was a good example. If you think about how easy that transition was at Apple and where they are today, they haven't hardly missed a step or hardly missed a beat. But then think about Hewlett-Packard, HP. This is a company that should know all about succession planning. They're a pioneer in technology. And yet they had a series of unplanned changes at the CEO level. They went from Carly Fiorina to Mark Hurd to Leon Apotheker, and now they've got Meg Whitman. And think how often or how frequently that's changed, how quickly that has happened. In each case, the CEO was radically different from the previous one. So it appeared they didn't have any plan to build successors internally and prepare them. They just jumped from person to person, not even having any continuity in the position. As a result, we've seen what's happened in HP. We've seen how much its stock dropped and how much uncertainty there was in the leadership. Now, certainly they're not going to just go away, but it had a big impact on the organization. Now, if this is what happens at the senior level, imagine what's happening at the next level down and the third level down in organizations where critical positions are not filled with successors who have been prepared. So I would say it's probably a mixed bag. Half of the organizations might do well, but the smaller the organization, the less good of a job that they're doing in succession planning. In terms of responsibility, we're going to cover that at the end, Dan. We're going to talk about how do you do succession planning, who should be involved in that. So I'm going to save that answer, or that part of the answer, till the end. And now, Ramona, you asked a very long question. I know you talked about civil service earlier, and I was going to touch on that in just a minute. How to identify current employees hired to do a job at a certain level but don't have opportunity to expand into higher level, more complex activities. And that's definitely an issue, because part of succession planning is letting people take on responsibilities, get more involved in different activities. Remember that job rotation, that job enrichment, job enhancement, working on action assignments and experiential assignments. If that's not planned, then it probably won't happen. So the position becomes available, and they assume the next person in line is qualified, but you're right, they haven't proved their qualifications because there hasn't been a succession plan in place that identified the gaps in their competencies and prepared them, developed them for that position. And not just one person, because then we'd be pre-selecting. We want to have a multiple, 3 or 4 or 5 potential successors that are being developed and see which one evolves to become the most competent, the most qualified for the position. That does 2 things. It creates a little bit of competition among those potential successors to really get serious and own that development plan. But it also gives us opportunities if one of them happens to drop out. So if we're grooming a successor and we're only grooming one person and they leave, then we're as worse shape as if we didn't plan at all to replace those critical positions. Now, I know this happens a lot in civil service, because in civil service jobs it is a closed system. They don't do a lot of recruiting and hiring from outside because of the way the system's designed, and that's part and parcel, 1, because of union requirements and contractual requirements, and 2, because the government has for years had this institutional belief that the best people it's going to find are going to be people in the chain of command or in the hierarchy of the organization. And you're right, you don't see a lot of good things happening. I'm going to talk to you, though, about an organization you might look into that publish some information about succession planning in the private sector. So are there any questions so far? We've talked about the critical positions, identifying competencies, identifying the gaps, developing these potential successors, and capturing knowledge, institutional knowledge, so that it's existing somewhere for those successor positions. Okay, the last one we're going to talk about then is going to have to be the metrics. How do we measure the success of our program? When we finish that, then we're going to talk about, back to Dan's question about who should be involved in this process. How do we get started with this? And this might be something that will help you, Ramona, too, to give you an idea of how you can develop a succession planning team within your organization and start having conversations about this kind of a process and why it's so important. And I'm also going to talk to you about a little bit about something we did with the IRS just a little while ago, or actually it was a few years ago. We did this same kind of work with the IRS in developing competency models so they would know what's required for key positions, and then development planning for individuals so they can prepare for those positions. So what kind of key outcomes are we looking for in our succession planning? What kind of key things should we look for? If we have a good succession planning program and we are identifying critical positions, competencies, gaps, developing potential successors, and capturing that knowledge, what do you suspect, or what would you expect to be the outcome in an organization, in any organization? What kind of outcomes would you expect to see, positive outcomes, or positive changes in an organization? Let's give you a minute just to think about that. What kind of indicators or key outcomes would you expect to see in an organization if you did a good job of succession planning? Good. Productivity increase. I'm not sure if it'll increase, Alan, but I definitely would expect that it would at least maintain its consistent level. And because we are doing such a good job of grooming successors, it would be likely to spill over to other departments and see some increase. Yeah, no interruption of business. Continual. We don't want to have what happened to HP where their stock dropped 32%. Sales growth, that's a potential outcome. Acceleration of services. Good. So if we do succession planning properly, you're right. These are the kind of things that we should be seeing. And how are we going to measure those things? How are we actually going to measure the things that we think we're going to see as outcomes? I think there was one more comment. No, okay. Well, here's one thing we can look at. Very simple. We want to look at the depth of our successor pool. How many candidates versus the key positions? If we have 100 key positions and we have 10 candidates, that's not a very good pool depth. We want to have a percentage where we've got more candidates, more successor candidates than we have key positions. Because that's going to give us a little more flexibility in developing people. It's going to create that little bit of competition among people to develop themselves, to learn the competencies we're looking for, and it's going to avoid having just one successor being developed and have them leave the organization or have something happen and we have no successors. So that's one of the simple metrics that we want to use to see if we're doing things correctly. We want to look at the number of candidates we've assessed versus our total candidates. So if we have 50 total successor candidates for a number of different positions, we want to look at how many of them have we actually assessed. Because if we haven't assessed their competencies and identified the gaps and started them on a development plan, then it won't matter when the critical position becomes vacant, we're not going to have anybody ready. So these are simple metrics we can use at the front to evaluate the ongoing process. We want to look at employees in key positions who are retirement eligible in the next 5 years. How many eligibles versus the actual key position headcount. We want to look at position stability rate. How often do key positions become vacant? If we know how often positions become vacant, we know how many people we should be identifying as potential successors, and we need to know how fast we need to develop those people. So if I know I have a high vacancy rate, then I know I want to have a larger number of potential successors at any one time that I'm developing. So that's how I'd use that metric. So these are metrics that we can use to manage our succession plan, manage our program. We want to look at how are we using our successor pool. So we look at key positions filled by successor candidates versus total key positions filled. And I think Ramona, in the case of civil service, we may have a number of candidates that have been identified as successors, but very often you'll find that somebody is selected who is really not a prepared successor. They were pre-selected or picked out of the system because it was their turn. And unfortunately in the private sector and even in the public sector you see this happen, where you might have a succession planning program, but then the CEO or the executive will pick somebody who is not in that program or is really not the best prepared, and they'll fill that position. So if we look at that, that's a way that we can identify our program as not being effective, not working well. There's the net cost of hiring externally versus internal hiring. We know that there is a higher cost of hiring externally than internally. That's a given. So knowing what that net cost is important for us as a way of emphasizing the importance and the need for our succession planning program. So where do you start? Those are some metrics you can use to measure your program. Yes, will we measure productivity and interruption of business and sales growth? Absolutely, those things should happen. But we need to have metrics within the program itself to make sure we are doing the proper things in our program and we're using it the way we intended to. And these are the kind of measures you want to use. If I was in civil service, I'd want to have these kind of measures in place for my successor planning so that I can show my executives whether or not we're actually using the program or not, whether we're using the program effectively or not. And oftentimes, we're not able to have that evidence available, and that's why we can't make the case for succession planning. So here's where you start. This goes back to your suggestion. I think it was Dan, you had mentioned this earlier about who should be involved. And you need to have a number of people involved. It's going to depend on the size of your organization and the makeup of your organization. But obviously executive senior leaders have to buy into the program. But you want your HR professionals on board. And this is the team you put together in developing your succession plan. It's not something you have HR do on their own. Because very often when HR does it alone, it's disregarded. It's not considered to be a useful or a necessary program. So managers, supervisors, union leaders, if you're going to be developing succession planning and you want a team in civil service, you have to have your union leaders on board. That's essential. But you also have to have your managers on board and your executives, your SCFs on board to make sure they're going to support this kind of a program. And we did this at the IRS, I guess now it was about 8 years ago. And we were working with tax auditors, customer service reps, revenue agents, trying to help them develop a program where they could plan better for a succession because we knew that people were going to be retiring. Remember, we have all these baby boomers, a lot of people retiring, and as the years were getting, as the years became closer and closer towards their retirement time, we were facing losing a lot of people. So we did a study of the organization, identified the competencies, the key competencies in the organization for these different positions, and then let them start identifying individuals who needed to be developed into those positions or potentially for those successor roles. We had good support from the executives in the organization. We had a good team. It would include most of these people you see here. And after about a year, we had a pretty good idea of what needed to be done, how it should be done. But unfortunately, it's just like any other organization. You can put a team together and develop a plan, but it has to be implemented. And the fault there was it was a good plan, but it was never followed through. Part of the reason was it took us so long, and this again part of the problem with civil service, it took so long for the process to develop, it took so long to create the program that a lot of the people who were leaders of that team left the organization. And since we didn't have a succession plan in place, we didn't have somebody to step in who understood what we were doing. So some of the successors that were selected for the positions of members that left the team didn't know what we were doing, weren't a part of the process, and so it was dropped, unfortunately. And it's unfortunate what happens. The longer it takes you to develop your program, the more likely you're going to lose some of your team members, and then you're going to lose support for the program. So the second part of that, once you have your team in place, is communication, communication. Everybody needs to be involved, and there's always a debate about should we tell employees that we're having a succession plan, that we want to do this kind of a program, because it does create kind of a sense of, yeah, you make people aware, but they have an anticipation that they're going to be in that successor group. So we do want to have a plan, though, to educate people, to make sure they understand what we're dealing with, understand the key issues, know what the benefits are, but also know what the concerns are in having this kind of a program. We can do climate surveys, we can do focus groups within our organization to find out how we're doing as we develop our program, get reactions to the program. So it's important to have communication about your succession plan. Some organizations fail because they keep it close to the vest. They don't want to tell anybody about who's being groomed as a successor. They don't want to talk about the program, but if people are not aware of it, they're not going to buy into it. We want to make sure that we're using the right people to communicate our plan. So we want to make sure we have the appropriate presenters. They can deliver the appropriate message and take the best approach. You want to have people who are communicating who are at the level of the individuals they're talking to. You want to have union reps that are going to be talking to the union members. You want to have managers talking to other managers that are explaining the system, explaining the process in language that people will understand. Of course, we want to anticipate key issues, key concerns. People are going to be concerned. They're going to be worried, am I going to be eligible for this? Does this mean that you're trying to force me out of a position? There's a lot of different questions you're going to hear, so we want to keep a list of those frequently asked questions. That's part of our communication, is publishing that list of FAQs so that people will know what's going on. Communicate, communicate, communicate. And we can't say that too much. Now, back to... So any questions about the metrics, about the measures, and about how we start this program, how we put our team together in communicating? somebody has to be the champion of this kind of a succession planning program, somebody at an executive level. There needs to be somebody who's going to champion the program and keep it alive, because at first there's going to be some skepticism, and if you haven't done a program, or as in the case of the IRS, if you had done a program or tried to start a program and it didn't follow through, then people can be jaded in their views about whether it's going to work or not. Ramona, one place that you might want to look for some research about civil service is the Improvement and Development Agency for Local Government. It's called IDEA. They did some research about succession planning in local organizations, and they were looking at local, state, and national organizations within the health sector and different regulatory bodies like the Environmental Protection Agency. So you might want to look at this. You could Google the IDEA, Improvement and Development Agency, and they published some research about the public sector, and that might give you some more information. So, do we have any questions? Any more questions? At this point, I don't see anybody typing. Okay. So we talked about critical positions, finding those critical positions. You have to identify them. We don't want to have too many critical positions, but we want to make sure we're identifying the real ones that we need, like that single incumbent. We want to identify the competencies that are required in that position, and not necessarily the laundry list in a job description, but the competencies, the attitudes, the attributes that make a person successful. And then we want to look at the gaps between potential successors and what those competencies are, have plans to develop those competencies in those successors, an ongoing plan that's going to take maybe 12 months to 36 months. And then capture the knowledge of the people that are potentially leaving. Capturing that knowledge management is important. Institutional knowledge is something we don't want to lose, because once it's gone forever. And then we look at some of the metrics that we want to use in evaluating and monitoring our succession planning program. Dan says it would appear that succession planning as a factor of organizational leadership would be formal performance measures for managers and leaders at all levels. I agree, Dan. That's an excellent observation. That's something that I would recommend that any organization do. One of the measures, one of the things that we do to evaluate a manager's success and manage a leader's success is how well is that succession management program working. So if you go back to those metrics we were looking at, those would be good indicators to use to evaluate and reward managers and leaders for using a succession planning model. But we know that if we do that, there will be, as mentioned before, as Jennifer mentioned before, there won't be interruptions of service and interruptions of business. We won't have these individuals taking over positions and they're not ready to hit the ground running. Succession planning doesn't have to be complex. It can be used in medium, small, large organizations. It can be as complicated as you want to have it. But if we're not thinking about who's going to be replacing people in the next 12 to 36 months, if we don't know who's retiring, if we don't recognize critical positions where we're going to have a potential loss of individuals because of job burnout, for example, then we're left to just hope for the best. We look at the succession planning team. Who should be on that team? What should they consist of? How well should we communicate? And some of the companies that have done a good job of this are Apple, I mentioned before, L'Oreal, the cosmetics company. IBM has done a good job of this. Unfortunately, HP didn't. In addition, Ramona, another organization that did a study on civil service succession planning was Price Waterhouse. So if you go, and I don't have that link handy, but if you Google Price Waterhouse Civil Service Succession Planning, I think you'll pull up the study that they did a few years ago. So this is not where we want organizations to be, although this is a way traditionally a lot of organizations have done succession planning. Eventually, son, you'll be in charge of all this, assuming, of course, that I can't come up with a better alternative. Succession planning is not just for CEOs anymore. It's for all organizations and all critical positions. And the better job we do, the better off we're going to be. Now, you can get a link to this presentation. I think that Jennifer gave it to you earlier on. You'll be able to pull up this PowerPoint and look at all the slides we just looked at. And at the end of this presentation, there are some references you can look at in terms of developing leadership succession planning, some good examples that you can use, some good references you can use if you want to sell this kind of a program for your organization. So if we don't have any additional questions, Jennifer, that's what we have for today. I think we've got about 8 minutes left.
Yeah. Okay. Well, as we wrap up here, we'll be on the webinar for a little bit more, so if people have questions, please feel free to type those in the chat box. But I'd like to thank you, Dr. Wilmore. You've given us some great information as we consider this topic that can sometimes be hard to get our arms around. I appreciate your 5 steps to take and giving us an idea of the time frame, and then also making it very concrete for us with some steps that we can take. I'd like to just remind folks about the next webinar. On March 10th, 2 weeks from today, Dr. Diana Webb will join us for a presentation on personal finance. And if you'd like to register for the webinar, you can go to that webinar's website, global.cmich.edu/pdwebinars. Okay, great. Thanks for putting that link up there, Todd. Again, I'd like to thank all who joined us today, and just a reminder that you will get an email with a link to the webinar's website where you can view the archived webinar there as well, and also you'll find the PowerPoints from today's webinar. That email that you receive will contain a link to a brief survey where you can give us feedback on today's webinar and let us know your thoughts for future webinars to offer. So if you have a few minutes, please take some time to give us some feedback. Again, I'd like to thank you, the audience, and I hope you find that today's webinar was helpful. I look forward to seeing you at one of our future webinars. So have a great rest of your day.